Awesome. Good evening, everyone. My name is Justin Kirshner, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Greater Cincinnati Voter Collaborative, often referred to as GCVC. On behalf of GCVC and our partner organizations and tonight's co-host, Xavier University's Take It On initiative, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Civic Literacy in Today's Political Climate. I'd also like to thank our partners, the News Literacy Project, WVXU, Cincinnati's local NPR station, as well as our sponsor, the Murray and Agnes Seasongood Government Foundation. The Greater Cincinnati Voter Collaborative works to advance nonpartisan civic and electoral engagement through a collective empowerment model throughout Greater Cincinnati. We envision a community with universal voter registration and 100% voter participation, where multi-generational voters are educated and empowered to improve the civic health, respect inclusive democracy, and promote the common good. Take It On is Xavier's nonpartisan, values-centered initiative to proactively promote better civic discourse and robust, peaceful engagement in politics. They seek out differences with the aim of learning from others. They explore controversial topics with civility and an interest in finding common ground, and they promote civic engagement that balances politics, academics, and well-being. This evening's forum and panel discussion will focus on the implications news literacy has on democracy. Leveraging expertise and resources from the News Literacy Project, participants will gain the tools to become responsible news consumers in the era of 24/7 headline-driven and social media-infused news cycles. As members of society continue to experience the polarization and watch extreme agendas make their headway into national conversation, it is important to safeguard ourselves with the knowledge to be upstanding citizens that seek to uphold the principles of democracy which are under threat. This begins with an educated electorate that is capable of navigating through misinformation and disinformation, and that propels us towards seeking truth and constructive dialogue. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Ethan Hall of Xavier's Take It On initiative to outline tonight's agenda and introduce our initial speaker. Ethan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ethan Hall, and I'm an ambassador with Take It On's dialogue team. Thank you so much for being here tonight for this wonderful event. As Justin mentioned, Take It On's mission is to promote dialogue and civic engagement in the Xavier community, and a key component of that mission is news literacy. After all, it's hard to have substantial dialogue and engage with politics without being properly informed. That is why we are so thrilled to host this event on the importance of news literacy and its effects on democratic politics. We'll start with the presentation from the News Literacy Project, followed by a panel discussion, and there will also be time for Q&A at the end. Now, before we get into the heart of today's event, I'd like to call to the stage Abby White and Emily Croft and thank them for all their hard work as our Take It On fellows this past year.
Thank you so much.
Now
do we have the other one, Justin? Hello?
The News Literacy Project is a nonpartisan education nonprofit focused on building a national movement to promote news literacy in American society, with the goal of creating a more informed, more engaged, and more empowered populace. They strive to educate people of all ages and backgrounds on how to identify credible news and information and build an understanding of the indispensable role that the free press plays in a democratic society. In a world where it's harder than ever to identify fact from fiction and reality from conspiracy, their work to educate and empower individuals to be more discerning consumers of news and information is a light in the darkness. News literacy is foundational to our democratic society, and it helps people civically engage in a more meaningful, authentic, and empowering way, while also organizations accountable. We are pleased to be joined tonight by Brittney Smith from the News Literacy Project. Brittney joined NLP after 8 years of teaching high school right here in Cincinnati. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Cincinnati and a master's degree from Mount St. Joseph University. She is currently pursuing a doctorate in educational practice and innovation at the University of South Carolina. She will be giving a presentation on the importance of news literacy and how we can become more responsible news consumers. Please give a round of applause for Brittney Smith.
Hello, everyone. Change the slides. Okay, so, oh wow, that's loud. Good evening again. I'm so honored to be here speaking with you all this evening. If you take a look at the screen, this is a tweet from 2022. And so if I were asking you to fact check this, can somebody just yell out, what's one of the first things you noticed about this tweet? Is there anything strange about it to you? The name of the media. Yes, yes. So that's actually one of the red flags that I called out. So is the Manta Tribune a real publication? We don't know. Anything else? This is kind of a tricky one. Okay, I'll give you the answer. Why isn't there a link to the source? There's just a picture. Right, so we can't fact check this ourselves at all. And after Googling, I found that the Manta Tribune is actually a satire-based newspaper. And then I looked at the actual tweet yesterday, and I saw that about 5,600 people have retweeted this without comment. And there are 9,500 people who've liked it. And then if you look at the comments, most of it is, wow, nice. Yep, the cheat was in again. And we see a few people asking questions. It looks shocked to me. But most of the people are just accepting that without even evaluating this information first. And so we've kind of already gone through my bio, so I'm going to skip most of the information here. But I just want to tell you what I do at the News Literacy Project, or NLP for short. Most of what I do is to work with educators, school districts, state departments of ed, to bring our products to school districts and become partners. I also do training, so I train educators. I was in New York for Election Day, talking to their teachers about news literacy and how it affects democracy. So that's some of my favorite work to do, is work with educators. I do have some contact information there. I also will put up a QR code at the end of my presentation that contains a link to a document with my contact information as well. These are some pictures of my students that I always love to show off. So who is the News Literacy Project? We were started in 2008 by Alan Miller, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He did a school visit and realized that many of the students that he encountered didn't know how to evaluate information. And so he felt strongly that educators needed support in that area, and he began creating resources to assist in that education. Recently, we've expanded to include materials for the general public as well. And our mission is to advance the practice of news literacy and, as Ian said, create a better, more engaged, better informed, and more empowered populace, and ultimately a stronger democracy. We know that misinformation is a direct threat to democracy. So speaking of misinformation, what even is misinformation? So misinformation It's going to be anything that is false, that is misleading, that is inaccurate or incorrect, regardless of the intent to deceive. A lot of people get mis and disinformation kind of mixed up. They think misinformation was put out on accident, not in a purposeful way. However, based on the work of Dr. Claire Wardle at the News Literacy Project, we say that disinformation, of course, it was designed to deceive people, but it's really a subcategory of misinformation. So we don't really think of them as being two separate things, kind of being under the same umbrella. And misinformation comes in many types. Earlier I showed you some satire that was taken out of context, but there are many different types of misinformation out there. And the issue is that there isn't always a clear line between fact and fake. The most convincing misinformation is going to have an element of truth. So usually it's not totally fake. And for that reason, if you look at professional fact-checking organizations, they're going to use a rating system. And they use that rating system because really misinformation is very nuanced, right? It could be something that is true in one context, but when taken out of context, it changes the complete meaning of the piece of information. One of the hallmarks of misinformation is that it relies on emotional manipulation to spread. And so it's going to activate that emotional reasoning where you think, well, sounds true. I'm just going to go ahead and share it on Facebook. Instead of activating our rational reasoning where we are fact-checking and Googling and trying to find out if this is something that we want to share with our social networks. Now, why is this a problem? Well, I think probably most people in the room have seen this in action. And you know that typically we use information to make decisions, which become our actions. But when we have misinformation in play, it changes our decisions and those subsequent actions. And it's all based on some false information that we got at the beginning. Okay, so this is going to exploit those deeply held beliefs, and as I said, it's going to elicit really strong emotions. And one thing that I really want to point out about why news literacy is so important today is that we are living in what the World Health Organization calls an infodemic. That means we're living in a state of information overload. We are presented with information at every turn, and there's so much of it that honestly you can't even fact check it all because it's everywhere, especially our teens that don't have the great reasoning skills that maybe some adults do. Boy, they're just bombarded at every turn by information. And in fact, this is the most complex information landscape that there has ever been in human history. The best way to fight misinformation is through education, okay? We want to build a public that can discern fact from fiction and stop misinformation in its tracks. We say that news literate people can use the standards of fact-based journalism to interact with news and information in ways that promote participation in civic life, right? So people are going to be empowered to vote, empowered to speak about ideas that are really passionate to them, and to work for causes. And the basis of that is news literacy, understanding what's going on in the world around you. So what can you do, right? Because it sounds kind of bleak, but there's actually a lot we can do. The first thing that I always tell people is that when you encounter something that makes you feel a little angry, maybe you should stop, take a breath, and do some searching. See if that information is correct, right? Because any emotion can actually be used to manipulate. You can use fear and sadness and anger, but you can also use humor, right, or shock to manipulate people. So anytime you're feeling a strong emotional reaction, stop and fact check. And with that comes being a healthy skeptic. We don't want people to be cynical, right, but we want them to be skeptical of information that they encounter. So if you're encountering information, use Google. And we have this infographic called Google Like a Pro. It's actually linked to the sheet that I will share with you momentarily. See if it's already been fact-checked. So here are some of the News Literacy Project's favorite fact-checking organizations. As a matter of fact, I have a colleague who used to work for Snopes, and I've learned so much about fact-checking from him. So check out some of these sources and see what they have said about that piece of information. When it comes to voting, you want to prioritize nonpartisan sources. So at NLP, we always say that we teach you how to think, not what to think. We want to teach you how to think critically so that you can be empowered to make your own decisions. So you want to use those nonpartisan sources so that you can get the facts and form your own opinions. And then, of course, I have to throw in a shameless plug. Join the Rumor Guard. The Rumor Guard is one of our newest platforms, and it's actually a platform that teaches you how to fact check. So you can log on to Rumor Guard. We source pieces of information from across the media, and we will fact check them and show you how we did it, right? So that you can train your brain to do those things on your own. And finally, I want to share some of our resources. One thing I haven't told you is that every resource that we offer at the News Literacy Project is totally free. All of our resources for the community, all of our resources for educators, totally free of charge. For the general public, I mentioned Rumor Guard, but we have an entire suite of resources. I want to mention our podcast is that a fact. We had a new episode come out today, and we have new episodes come out every Thursday. But we also have Checkology, which is a virtual classroom. And then for educators, we also have a suite of resources. My favorites to talk about are Checkology, which is a free virtual classroom with lessons to implement with students. And if you'd like some resources, there's a QR code here. Feel free to scan. You'll get a Google document with links to all of our resources and websites, as well as my contact information and my references for the information that I presented today, because I want you to know where it came from. And I'll take a moment, but the next slide was just saying thank you so much, and I'll leave it here so you all can grab that QR code. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brittney, for that amazing presentation. We're now going to have a panel discussion on news literacy hosted by Take It On's Civic Engagement Fellow, Abby White. Abby is a graduating senior with a double major in philosophy, politics, and the public, as well as communications. Abby has been a fellow with the Take It On initiative since her sophomore year at Xavier, and in her time here, she has worked on various campus dialogue events, voter registration initiatives, and media campaigns to offer Xavier students resources for civic engagement. Please welcome Abby and the rest of our panelists to the stage.
All right, thank you, Ethan, so much for the wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to now introduce our panelists for the evening. And then we'll get right into the questions. So our first panelist, who we just had speak, is Brittney Smith, who gave us a wonderful presentation on news literacy. As Ethan mentioned, she's a graduate of the University of Cincinnati, but we won't hold that against her, as well as Mount St. Joseph University, and she's currently pursuing her doctorate in educational practice and innovation at the University of South Carolina. We're also joined by two reporters from WVXU, the local Cincinnati branch of NPR. First, we have Becca Costello. She is an experienced local government reporter who reports on all things local government with a specific focus on the city of Cincinnati. She's a graduate of Cincinnati Christian University and Indiana University, where she received a master's degree in journalism. Throughout her career, Becca has earned numerous awards for her reporting, including from local chapters of the Associated Press and Society of Professional Journalists. Joining Becca is Howard Wilkinson, a senior political analyst from WVXU. Howard has had a long and distinguished career as a reporter, having covered every Ohio governor's race since 1974, including 16 presidential nomination conventions and 4 presidential inaugurations. In 2012, Howard was honored and inducted into the Cincinnati Journalism Hall of Fame, deservedly so for his now 50 years of journalism covering local, state, and national level politics. And last but not least is Dr. Randy Patnode, who is an associate professor in Xavier's communication department. Dr. Patnode currently teaches courses in mass media, media literacy, media writing, and communication technologies. His primary research interest is in the history of communication technologies, an area which he has conducted extensive research in. So, before we get started, give a quick round of applause for our panelists. All right, I'm going to pull up the seat real quick, and then we'll dive into our questions. All right, so we already have a few questions prepared for our panelists that they've prepared, and then we will take some questions from the audience as well, so be thinking about what you might want to ask them. Our first question, specifically directed towards Randy and Brittney, is what role should schools play in promoting news literacy among students? Anyone else can jump in and answer, just hit the little button to speak. Go right ahead.
So at the News Literacy Project, we would like to see widespread requirements for news literacy training across K-12. We strongly encourage states to adopt these as graduation requirements and hope that students will have some news literacy training by the time they leave secondary education in preparation for civic activity when they graduate.
Well, I must be in support of media education because I teach that. I just got out of my media literacy class.
Can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Oh, I can speak louder. You want me to speak out the microphone?
If you pull it closer.
Okay. How's this?
Oh, no, you just turn it.
Oh.
How's that? Are we good? Okay. Yeah, so beyond just the K-12 level where we'll probably see this type of education developing, we teach it in the higher levels as well. And it's not terribly different. It's a lot of the same concepts. I still have my material from the News Literacy Project, so I'm all in favor of it. So, yeah, we find it quite useful. Part of the challenge is just that students today come so media saturated and it becomes so ordinary in their use that they don't necessarily acknowledge how the information is being constructed or where it's coming from. And so we just kind of have to separate those issues for them. Okay.
Should I try again?
Oh.
All right, try one more time.
I think we're safe. Okay. So my husband is a high school English teacher as well at a public school, and so I've talked to some of his students, and I think one of the biggest concerns I have is that there's so much variation, and it's so dependent on the school and even more so on the teacher. So the idea of having like a graduation standard or something that all high school students or students before college, I think makes a lot of sense because some students might graduate with a great sense of literacy and news literacy, and others might have none. I think one of the other things is, we mentioned that students now have so much saturation in media, and I think younger folks sometimes have this sense of false confidence that they can recognize things that are very obviously fake, but they're not having that critical mindset to look at things that are less obvious. And some misinformation is unintentional. A lot of it is intentional, and the people who are doing that are smart, and they know how Gen Z and whatever generation comes after Gen Z, they know what could potentially fool them. And so they're constantly changing the way that misinformation comes out. So I think that sense of false confidence, because I see stuff on TikTok all the time. It's like, oh, boomers used to tell us don't trust anything you read on the internet, and now they're so gullible. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's maybe a little true, but so are you, and you don't recognize it. So I think that false confidence is a big issue.
Oh, man. Okay.
Yeah, you can just use the one that works.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Scared me. Yeah, I agree entirely. But one of the things I do in my spare time is tutor and mentor journalism students at Walnut Hills High School, right down the road. I've been doing that for 9 years now, and we're wrapping up another year. I was out there this morning, and this has been I've seen it evolve over those 9 years to where, students would come in and they would be extremely gullible about these things, but they're getting smarter all the time. And, and some of it, Brittney, I think is due to, programs like yours. But, I taught them how to use Schoology, and they do. But they can spot things. They're smart. And Walnut Hills High School is well, you got to be pretty smart to get in there in the first place. But I have some hope that the next generation of journalists is going to be much better at this. Just because people are getting better at spotting this stuff. And I think the general public is the same way. That over a period of time, people are going to catch on to this stuff. And when they do, it's going to shut down a whole lot of these operators who are trying to put out false or just inaccurate information. So I'm pretty hopeful about it.
All right, next question is, how do you think that different media organizations contribute to or hinder news literacy efforts?
Is that for us?
If somebody else has an answer, I'd like to think about this for a few seconds. So I spent some time a little while ago going through one of our lessons called Harm and Distrust, which talks about how the media has impacted the way that Black Americans feel about news. And I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that many newsrooms lack diversity, not just in the reporters, but in the types of stories that they cover. So for some demographics, there's this feeling of, well, they don't really care about what's happening in our community. They're only showing the bad, so I'm not going to listen to anything they have to say. So I think that one thing that could help improve not just news literacy, but like trust in the media is kind of diversifying journalism, maybe bringing school newspapers to schools that are inner city that don't have them. Because Walnut Hills has one, but I taught at Dater High School and we didn't have one.
Western Hills just started.
Yeah, so it seems like the student publications are kind of concentrated in certain types of schools. And so I think, widespread training will definitely help.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And, we deal with these issues all the time in our newsroom. Becca can tell you about it because she's been involved in a lot of the planning and trying to reach out to different communities here, because they have to. I mean, it would be ridiculous not to. People are getting their information, there was a time, like in public radio, where most of the information was coming from car radios. Well, that's not the case anymore. People are picking it up online, they're getting all kinds of feeds, they're getting, people are listening all over the place. That's why our, radio ratings are going up all the time. And with that, it means a more diverse audience. And we have to be aware of that. And I think, they've done a pretty good job, for the most part, of trying to create a newsroom that thinks about these things and does something about them. We've got all kinds of things where we follow up with people that we talk to on various stories and columns, just to see who they are. Are we talking to the same kind of people all the time? Are we talking to white males, or middle-aged white males all the time? Are sources diverse? And we're tracking that information internally. And I think it's good, a good step. I worked for 30 years at the Cincinnati Enquirer, and they would try this kind of thing every once in a while. But then they would lose interest. Then they move on to something else. And it was just like, they'd hit this little bump. But there was no sustained effort to do that, ever, in all those 30 years. And at least, like with WVXU and Cincinnati Public Radio, I see a more sustained effort. I think you would agree with that, would you not?
Yeah, I've been at WVXU only a little over 2 years, so, it is a pretty short window. I think what sticks out to me from what Brittney said is, so there's two types of diversity in the newsroom. One is who is in your newsroom, and one is who you're reporting on and what you're reporting on. And I think one of the things that newsrooms have tried to do is report on communities that they haven't been reporting on. And with that, if you're a mostly white newsroom, if a white reporter is reporting on a community they're visiting for the very first time, that's a really good recipe for misinformation. I think the unintentional kind of misinformation. So I think that's one of the reasons diversifying the newsroom is important. And I'll just say, we're trying, and it's okay, I guess. I think we have a long way to go, is where I would conclude with that. But I do appreciate that, there's at least some support from management to try. In terms of, what else news organizations can do to kind of make news literacy easier, I think what I've done mostly is yell at my Twitter followers to click the damn link before they share it, and I don't think that's a very effective tactic. But that is a consideration when we're crafting headlines, knowing that most of the people who encounter that article are only going to read the headline and the teaser and see the photo. So something that's interesting is to look at, go look at the same story at multiple news organizations and see different headlines that they chose. And the instinct is to make it as exciting and groundbreaking as possible, and use the kind of clickbaity, you won't believe what this council member said today, or something like that. And maybe you'll get more clicks that way, but knowing that most people aren't going to click and read the whole story, I think we have a responsibility to make that headline as informative and accurate as possible, because it is so easy to be misleading in a headline, unintentionally. So easy to do that. So I think that's one thing that news organizations can be better. And I will say, I feel so lucky to work for a public media station. Every journalism job I've had has been in public media, so I've never had a boss come to me and say, your click rate is down 10%, so you're not going to get that raise you were expecting. I've never had to deal with that in my career. And other reporters have, and other outlets have, especially as local news reporting the budgets are going down. There's a lot of pressure to deliver traffic, and that's really hard. I don't think it's a good excuse for misinformation, but I say that recognizing my place of privilege, honestly, that, you know, we don't have to worry about that ad revenue and things like that. That was way more than I meant to say.
And that was a real problem at Cincinnati Enquirer. Fortunately, it was mostly after I left in 2012, and they started doing this clickbait thing. And, you know, they kept track of it, and they were judging people's performance based on the number of clicks that their stories got. So how were people responding? They were working for a corporation that wouldn't hesitate to, you know, lay them off or get rid of them. So they would just salute, say, yes, sir, we'll do whatever you like. And you ended up with these stories that were pretty dodgy. And I would hate to be in an organization now, well, I wouldn't do it, number one. I wouldn't be in an organization that judged me by the number of clicks that I get on a column or a story. It's just not worth it.
Well, the news media as a whole is at historic lows in terms of public trust. It's been on decline for 20, 30 years. People still trust most, at the local level, local TV is still the most trusted of the media. But part of the challenge for the news media is that they don't have a whole lot well, the trust issue is their branding. They're understood by the public as strictly by their brands, and people are evaluating just the brand. They're not evaluating necessarily specific journalism. And they just don't do a very good job of promoting their own welfare. Journalism needs to, for instance, do a better job of explaining how it creates its stories, because most of the public does not exactly trust how they do it. They think, for instance, among my students, the prevalent view is that all journalists are in the tank for somebody. They're either being paid off or they're advocates of some kind of political agenda. And some of them think that that's the litmus test to get into the job. I try to convince them otherwise, that there are other reasons why this might be problematic, but it's a tough sell. So I think, one, if journalistic organizations would just do a better job, for instance, of just explaining how they do how this story was composed. Why did we talk to some people and not others? Why did we even put this on our news agenda today? All of these little things that are just assumed to be understood, so that it would be more visible. I think that would help to establish with the public some kind of rapport about how the product is composed. The other challenge that the other panelists have mentioned is just money. Yeah, there was a time when you only gauged the number of copies of the newspaper that was sold, not the individual stories, because you just didn't know. Now it's possible to know, so now you can disaggregate the story from the product itself. You know, we should remember that the ways in which most people experience, or at least young people experience, their news is in a disaggregated form. It's all decontextualized. It comes into you in your social media. It's a fragment. And it pops up into your media for a second. You don't necessarily know where it came from. And you reach conclusions about it anyway. So if we could take away some of the financial incentives for news organizations to do things like counting up how many clicks are on a story, we'd probably be better off. But of course, it's a commercialized industry, and it's hard to roll that back. We do, however, have some excellent public options. We have our representatives from public radio, for instance, who do a great job, and it's really one of the saving virtues in the journalistic field. It's not possible for us to do this in our country as well, to have a stronger public voice or publicly funded journalism. We get some money from the federal government through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, but it's a relatively small amount, and of course it's politically hot potato. But certainly other democratic nations have managed to do this. They have public media. And there's no reason that we can't do it as well, and it's to our benefit if we can pull that off.
Wonderful. And actually, Dr. Patnode, you kind of segued into our next question, which is, as print media continues to diminish and decline, do you think online or even social media news will begin to fill that gap? And if so, do you think that there's a specific business model that may be able to match the depth and the scope that print media once had?
Well, I mean, yes. Because, I mean, there's no reason for it not to be. You know, I mean, anything you can do on a sheet of newsprint, you can do online. In fact, you can do even more. You know, you have more, you know, print was always confined by space, and that's not an issue online. You know what, you know, if you write 5,000 words on a routine news story, then people aren't going to read it. But you have more opportunities online and through social media as well, by linking to stories that are on news websites, to examine issues in a much more detailed way, you know, with graphics, with statistics, with numbers, with photographs. And, you know, the problem, I mean, I love newspapers. You know, that was my life, you know, for a very long time. And I still love them. But they are confined by space. And the great thing about the internet is there's no limits.
Yeah, I think the online is, and the no limits, the extra space is especially helpful in radio because we're so limited by time on a short radio story that it's almost impossible to add sufficient context, but we can add all of that on the web story. And there are folks we can reach online that we wouldn't be able to reach in print, but I think the opposite is true too. I think we're really losing out on communities that are not necessarily online in the same spaces that we are online. You know, the internet is not, it's not easy to find things on the internet sometimes unless you're specifically looking for it. And so what's interesting, I think, is the relatively new news organization in Northern Kentucky, Link NKY, is that right, Howard? They obviously are putting everything online as well because I think you have to, but they also are printing a publication. It's a brand new organization, which is almost unimaginable to think, okay, we're going to start a news organization and print it and send it to people at their homes. But they're doing that, and I think it's a great idea. It's more expensive, it's harder to fund, but I think there are pros and cons to losing print, and I think that it is admirable that some organizations are trying. I mean, obviously we were never in print, so it would be weird for us to do that probably. But it's a similar idea, you know, being on the radio dial is, and free, it's accessible to anyone with a radio. So that said, I think, you know, yes, online is filling the gap, but I think that opens the door for more misinformation. And I think access, even though theoretically it seems like online would be more accessible, I think for some communities it's just not.
Yeah, the one thing, just quickly, the one thing about print is, and Becca's right, not everybody has equal access to this, but one of the great things about the infrastructure bill was that there was a whole lot of money in there for broadband, and we got to get everybody, and I mean everybody, whether it's, you know, inner city neighborhoods or Appalachian counties in Ohio, get them online so they can take advantage of this. I go to a little diner up in Clifton for breakfast pretty much every weekend. And the owner of the place, he's a great guy. He's, I think, either 77 or 78 years old now, Bobby. He's really interested in the news. And every Sunday, I will go over to the UDF and buy him a print copy of the Cincinnati Enquirer. And I'll take it to him when they deliver it. So, you know, a lot of times they don't even deliver it. But I'll bring it to him, and he'll look at it, and he'll say, these stories are 3 days old. because it's just a compilation of a bunch of stuff that's already appeared online during the week. There's nothing, almost nothing new in it. And people like Bobby are frustrated because he's not an online guy, and you're not going to make him. You're not going to make him do it. So I try to explain to him what's going on in the news business. He just shakes his head and says, "Oh, it's crazy. The world's gone mad." So think about Bobby too. Bobby deserves news too.
I want to add just one thing to what Becca said. When we think about the shift toward online publications, it is important to consider the other side, right? Like, it's becoming easier to then make publications dedicated to spreading misinformation. And advertising definitely doesn't help that. They are placing ads. Usually it's generated by like an algorithm. They just place ads where they'll get high clicks, right? So I think that maybe one way to encourage that might be to kind of rethink how advertising works and kind of check where companies are placing ads. Because right now the priority is revenue, not truth. So.
My point here is that I don't see this as a technological issue. That is, just because the news moves to the online environment does not mean that the source of our issues around democracy and whatnot are technologically built. They're really about organizations and how the organizations want to use the technology. News is news, in whether it's in audio or print form, and how it's delivered becomes kind of a false issue because people want to blame the technology. I think it's going to move regardless of what we might want, but as long as we have solid organizations that want to provide people with meaningful information, then we're going to be okay. Those organizations will adopt whatever technology is most useful to them, and they already have. We should also remember that technology is going to intervene one way or the other. Right now, we're all scared about how artificial intelligence is going to replace people who write news stories. It already has. It's been writing news stories for 10 years or so. It's been writing financial stories as well. And for the most part, the public doesn't know the difference. And we have to deal with that. So I don't necessarily fear the technology. I know we're going to adapt to it, but we still need to cultivate high-quality organizations that care about the information that they're providing.
Awesome. All right, we have one more question that also came from the Google form. So one of the participants here filled this out and asked, what are some of the best resources for those of us who don't enjoy following the news but want to continue to stay informed?
Okay, I'm gonna say NPR's, I think it's called Up First or Up Next. I listen every morning in the car with my children. And I think it's great because it delivers the news in a bite-sized piece and it kind of whets my appetite for more. And I'm like, ooh, I want to go learn more. So I think that's a great place to start for people that might not really want to read or listen to a whole news story. So yeah.
I think that's a great plug, and I will say, like, I do not like following the news, and that's partly, I think, a lot of journalists will probably say this. I'm so immersed in local news that by the time I'm off work, I'm like, I don't care what's going on nationally, and I know I should. I know that I need to be a better informed citizen, but I say that because I completely understand, like, it's exhausting, and it's usually depressing. So I totally get that. I think Up First is a great, from NPR. It's like, the longest one I've seen is like maybe 13 minutes or something. They're short. It's like the headlines and a couple of longer form stories. The Daily is hit or miss for me, which I probably shouldn't say because we air it on our radio station. But it's a longer one from the New York Times if you're not familiar. that typically does a deeper dive into 1 or 2 topics per episode. That one's usually a half hour, or I guess it's always a half hour. Those are 2 audio versions. I can't think of one off the top of my head because this is not the format that I prefer, but there are lots of email newsletters that will aggregate very short snippets from multiple news sources, and they'll send you an email that's like, here's 5 news stories that people are probably going to be talking about, you need to be aware about. Like I said, I can't think of one. I'm sure there are some that are like hyper-partisan and are probably not the best source of information. But I know there are some out there as well that are nonpartisan and can kind of give you the details, so you don't have to go looking. I guess what's easy for me is to fall into like only listening to NPR because it's on my clock radio when I wake up. It's my alarm clock in the morning. It's on my car radio when I get in the car. And as much as I love and trust NPR, it's never a good idea to rely on one news source. Things like an email newsletter are a good way to go to multiple news sources. Don't fall into the NPR is the only thing to listen to whole, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with that. Even some news organization, and we do this at WVXU on the Daily View. That's a good compilation of what's on our website each day, and include a link so if you want to know more, you can click on it. And I noticed lately that the Empire has sort of adopted the same style with their like a Daily View type thing, where they have a reporter introduce the thing and say, hey, read my story today. But you can't force these people. And if they want it, they're going to find it. Lord knows it's out there.
Yeah, to echo what others have said, you can't rely on one. That seems to be everybody's desire so that you don't have to think too hard, but there's no escaping. You have to just continue thinking. So diversity is good no matter what kind of diversity it is. Google News is fine. It's an aggregator site that basically impoverishes all the news organizations because it steals their advertising. But still, you'll get a variety coming from them. There's several news aggregator sites. Those are okay.
I will say one more thing I forgot, which is that, yes, social media is a bad place to get your news, but, as someone who spends time on social media in my off time, like just when I'm relaxing, your Twitter feed is as good as the people you follow. Like, don't follow people who are gonna give you misinformation. Twitter's a terrible example because everything has changed so much in the last couple months. But I use Twitter almost exclusively on TweetDeck, which is a third-party application. I use it on my web browser. I'm not usually looking at Twitter on my phone. And I can make it show me only the people I follow in specific lists. So I have a list for Cincinnati, even though I'm following people from all over. So if I only want to look at the people I'm following in Cincinnati, it's not going to show me blue checkmark people that I don't follow, and it's not going to show me promoted tweets that I don't follow. So that's one way to kind of force Twitter to only show you what you want to see. And I'll just give a shout out to like Facebook groups. I think are great. The Greater Cincinnati Politics, I'm looking at Steve because I know he's an active member of this Facebook group, Greater Cincinnati Politics, I think is what it's called. It was actually from the Inquirer. There are usually Facebook groups for specific neighborhoods or communities, and it's a good way to kind of passively get information. And that's, I see stuff in there that I wouldn't have thought to seek out. Don't make social media your only source for news, but if you're not inclined to go check, NPR.org or New York Times homepage, set up your social media feeds where that's going to come up anyway, even if you're not seeking it out. I think that can be a good way to kind of introduce a little more civic engagement into your life.
I will also add on the same note of social media. I just finished a capstone project for my digital media class about social media and news on TikTok. So all my Gen Z TikTokers in the room will appreciate this. I get a lot of my news from social media. I do check all the outlets and stuff like that and read the more, literate sites, but I do use a lot of TikTok for my news, so don't hate me for that. But what I find really helpful is to follow the officials directly. I would plug Representative Jeff Jackson from North Carolina. He's become really huge. He's a Democrat, but he gives just a really transparent overview of what's happening in Congress without a partisan stance to whatever he talks about. And also, if you want a little bit of humor with your politics, especially since these topics can be really heavy, Jon Stewart's podcast, I think, is always really funny and adds a little lightheartedness to a lot of really serious topics as well. So just from, the more social media, young person in the room, I think a lot of Gen Z specifically likes to get our news from social media, but it's just really important, like Becca said, who you're following and who you're taking into your feed. So thank you for that. Now we will open it up to questions from our audience. If anyone has anything that they'd like to ask, feel free to raise your hand and Justin will bring the mic around to you.
How do you teach young people to sort out what's a bias in news? You have some people say NPR is, biased. It's the liberal camp. They say that if New York Times is all fake news, and or the Wall Street Journal. I can figure out how to figure out what's biased and what isn't. It's subtle, but you can figure it out, but I'm highly educated. How do you teach that? And how to teach people to know what's really fake news and what is real fake news?
That's a really, really good question. And I think one of the things I've seen news organizations do better in the last couple of years is clearly label what is commentary versus, or an opinion, an op-ed versus from the newsroom, which I think is a huge positive step because the average news consumer doesn't know the difference, which is understandable if it's not labeled, if it's in tiny text at the bottom or something like that. So, it's one of those things where you read one story and it's like, whoa, that's super biased, not realizing that it's commentary, and then you write off that news organization, forever. So I think that's one thing I've seen that is positive, is more clearly labeling, what that is. Bias in journalism is such an interesting discussion because I think we've moved away. I think this is a positive change. I feel like we are moving away from, journalists are completely unbiased to teaching journalists how to set aside their bias when writing a story. And the difference is important because we all have bias. It's going to be there. It is impossible to remove the biases that I have. You can inspect them and try and, remove them from your instincts and things like that. That's important work and we should all do that. But it's impossible to, remove them completely. And I think it's better for journalists to recognize, here are some of my biases, and let me make sure that I'm not putting those into what I'm writing. That doesn't at all answer your question, but
Well, how do you teach?
How do you teach that recognition? I'm going to pass on this one. We've got some great experts on the table. It's a really good question. I don't have a good answer for it, so hopefully other people do.
So we have a lesson where we actually teach students how to zone information, which Becca mentioned, is teaching students to look for clues within the information that kind of tell you why it was created. So there are usually hallmarks that you'll see if it's an advertisement or if it's an opinion piece. And so just teaching students to recognize that can go a long way when it comes to how they take in news and information in general.
The short answer, it's hard. The longer answer is, there's a variety of things that one must do. They're all part of the umbrella of critical thinking, and which you can teach in any environment. It's becoming more challenging in the news environment, I guess, it's simply because people have more access to more information now than they used to. They used to have, you get the daily newspaper, maybe once a day you might watch the evening news, and that was the total of your news input. Today it's on constantly, and you're really never separated from it. And because of that, it kind of overwhelming, and you stop thinking. You're not in that mode of, well, I'm now going to assess the news, because it comes to you, it all looks like news. It's just more words or pictures. And so that's part of the challenge. And it's hard because it comes at you so fast that people are processing things so rapidly that they spend almost no time on any single message. And so you have to teach people to slow down to assess the messages. And you just have to give people an opportunity to work with these things. We do lots of dissection of news stories in class, and try to identify, some of the obvious things, which are the indicators that news organizations have thankfully started doing a better job of flagging what they're actually offering, whether it's news or advertising or opinion. But it's still a pretty dodgy process because there's always some money attached to ways of messages. And so you just have to teach people to be skeptical about what they're getting. And it takes a long time. So we just get started, really, and hopefully people get better as they go on.
Just one quick story. This morning, I was sitting with the 2 kids who are going to be the opinion editors of the student newspaper at Walnut Hills High School next year. And they were talking to me about this, idea of objectivity. And I said, forget about objectivity. There's nothing objective about news coverage, because you too, and your fellow editors are going to decide every day what gets covered and what does not get covered, what gets written about and what does not get written about. What you need to do is forget about objectivity and start thinking about fairness. That's what you should achieve, is fairness and respect for other people's opinions. Now, and I agree entirely, and I've told these kids this many times, you don't have to be cynical, but you do have to be skeptical of everything you see, everything you read, everything, ask questions and do the kind of things Brittney's organization is talking about, to fact check the things that you are reading online. But the kids that I talked to this morning, they got the idea. They said, okay, we never thought of it that way. So, there are ways to teach this. I'm done.
Going on to your point about fairness, though, doesn't that also, the way I would say is there something that's sort of somewhat broken in the news media, in the sense that in the search of fairness, the truth has to suffer sometimes. What I mean is that the way we consume news, there are things that have to be absolutely true. The earth is round. But if you watch the news, or in any kind of news media, the search for the fairness becomes, I'm going to find the person that says the earth is flat. Sometimes it happens, or it's given the impression that it may be equal because you see 2 people, one on each side of an equation. So you get the danger of you're amplifying the negative when it may not be actually true objectively, and then it becomes an issue. I just want to know.
No, that's a very good point. And there are some things that you don't have to be fair about. The sun rising in the morning is not one of them. The 2020 presidential election being stolen, you don't have to be fair about that. That's a lie. But I'm talking about like real issues, things where there are competing points of view that can make sense to different people. And you do have to be fair in those cases. But no, you're absolutely right. There are things that, why waste time running around finding somebody to tell you that the sun doesn't rise in the morning? I'm going to do that. That'd be ridiculous. And I'm not going to go running around finding people that believe that election was stolen, because it wasn't. We all know that. So, you know, there are things that you have to be fair about. Most things you have to be fair about. But there are things where that's not an issue.
This is one of my favorite things to talk about. So I think I completely agree with Howard, and I also know there were news organizations that went out and talked to people that thought the 2020 election was stolen. So I think that's a good example of, you know, there are things based in fact. And it's hard too, like when you have, it's one thing to like go out and look for someone who lives in this community who has that opinion versus there are elected officials voicing that opinion, which does that warrant news coverage? Yeah, probably. And that's a very fine line to walk because, you know, when we ask this question of ourselves all the time in the newsroom. Are we elevating a false opinion? Are we giving that person a bigger platform to spread misinformation? Versus, do voters deserve to know that the person that's on the ballot believes a lie? And that is really hard. It's a really hard line to walk. I think also there are really good examples of issues that we don't always agree on, that there's, you know, a fair side. You know, we have this thing about both sidesism, which even that term is not very good because there's never two sides to an issue. There are never only two opinions about an issue. But, you know, go back in time, and there was a time when it was a fair discussion to talk about should women have the right to vote. That wasn't always a given. It was up for debate. Now, would we ever invite someone on that says, I think women shouldn't be allowed to vote? Of course not. Of course we wouldn't do that. There are issues today that 100 years from now we'll look back and say, I can't believe we were giving voice to an opinion that now is such a given. But it is hard to identify in the moment what those issues are. I'm not saying this is one of those issues, but a more recent example I think is same-sex marriage and how much society has changed on that topic in the last 6 or 7 years. That, you know, 6 or 7 years ago, what was that, 2015? Oh my God, that's so long ago now. Let's just say 10 years ago. The way that news organizations talked about gay marriage, same-sex marriage, is so different than now. It's such a different way that we talk about now in newsrooms and just in society in general because of a cultural shift. And that's going to keep happening on countless things. And so I guess the point of that is to say, it's a conversation that I think needs to happen every single time this comes up. You know, are we elevating, giving someone a platform for false information? And one of the tests I think we give ourselves is like climate change is another good example. That conversation has changed, and you know, do we give voice to climate change deniers? And one of the reasons we don't is the vast majority of scientists agree that climate change is happening and that humans are causing it. And it took news media a long time to recognize that, I think. I think it took too long to get to that point. But when we have these controversial issues and we can look to respected organizations full of scientists that say 99% of us agree that this is the way to go, then we don't pull that 1% on and put them on a head-to-head debate. And there are trusted sources of information that we can use to help us make those decisions. I went all over the place with that. I'm sorry, but thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, the standards for how news media treat information are worthy of thinking about. Objectivity used to be a standard. It sort of grew out of the early part of the 20th century, out of the embrace of scientific thinking. And thus we adopted the language of scientists too, which was objectivity and observation. Today the key word seems to be fairness, but we have to take some care with fairness for whom. What we notice is that news organizations often will adopt this kind of two sides perspective, you know, interviewing the climate denier as well as the climate scientist, and interviewing the election denier as well as everybody else who has figured this out. And the reason oftentimes that the news media do this is not to treat the ideas fairly, but rather to ensure that they are seen as neutral players in the news environment. In other words, it's self-protective behavior. And they will argue, well, no, we're just trying to share all sides. But in fact, what's going on is they're simply trying to avoid being taken to task for taking a side. And yet, there are plenty of issues out there where they need to take a side because there really isn't a second side. But I think some news organizations are starting to get there. It's tempting, though, when you have people who are very loud and very persuasive and command the media stage, who say things that are just not, you know that are not true, and yet you still report on them. This was the 2016 election. There was a man who just was able to command the stage in a way that just made the media stand breathlessly waiting for his next words. And it was damaging. There's no question about it. So, yeah, fairness is a word that needs some investigation as well.
All right, we got one last question from the audience.
How do you promote a higher valuation of context, particularly for people who are maybe no longer in the educational system and or didn't have the resources while they were in it?
Could you repeat that?
How do you promote a higher valuation of context for those who are no longer in the educational system and maybe didn't have access to those resources while they were in it?
Okay. Context of news coverage?
Yeah, like purposefully seeking out like context when examining the media.
Well, I mean, that's context is everything to me in news writing. I mean, you got to put things in context for people, whether no matter where they are in their education. Without context, it's just jibber jabber. You know, it's really not anything that's of any kind of substance. Now, tell me this. You're saying for people who are no longer part of the education system?
Yeah, I'm just thinking because there's so many educational programs.
There's so many educational programs now, like this one, and
Yeah.
What she was talking about before with putting on those programs for educators and students, whereas maybe 20 years ago or even sooner, there weren't those things.
Well, you're right, there weren't. Brittney's organization started in 2008. And that may seem like a long time to some folks, but it really isn't a long time ago. But the resources are there now, and they're not limited to people who are currently in the education system, correct?
That's correct. So we do many events. We partner with community organizations like the NAACP, League of Women Voters, here at GCVC, to raise awareness for people who may not be getting it in the classroom. And then we offer a newsletter that comes out every week called Get Smart About News for the general public. And then we've got our podcast, we've got an app. So we are trying to make it accessible to people who are not in the education system anymore.
I think one of the things that is difficult is the people who need news literacy are not seeking it. They're not Googling, how can I be more news literate? And they're not seeing the amazing resources that Brittney has in their day-to-day life. And that is a very difficult, mountain to overcome. Like, they're not going to come to this panel or a similar, thing like this, even though it is open to the public. And I think that means that the onus is on us. One, to share those resources widely, to put them out so that your Facebook friends who are probably not following I assume you have a Facebook page, who are not following your Facebook page, so that they see it, because otherwise it's not going to show up for them in their feed. But I think too, I wish I could remember the source, the outlet that I read this article on, but it was about extremism and how people kind of fall down the rabbit hole of extremism. And one of the things that they talked about was that personal relationships were like the #1 way to interrupt a spiral into extremist beliefs. And that's a extreme example. But I do think, as hokey as this sounds, like when you're hanging out with friends and saying something as simple as like, oh, I saw this TikTok the other day that said blah, 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 and it made me really angry, but then I looked it up and it wasn't even true. Like, I can't believe that. Like, wow, people are really just out here saying anything. Again, that sounds so cheesy, but I think the more we make it part of everyday conversation, again, you're saying it to people who otherwise are not going to seek that out because they don't know they need to hear it. And, you're asking like outside of an educational setting, which I think is a really good question because critical thinking is like all education is. You're surrounded by it all the time, or should be, hopefully. So when you get outside of that, and, adults in general tend to get set into habits and ways of thinking that are hard to interrupt. So be an interrupter. Which is, I think, a quote from that. No, what movie am I thinking of? The detective. Anyway, it's a good movie, but I feel really cheesy for saying that. Just bring it up in everyday conversation, I think is an important thing. Or also when someone comes to you and says, like my parents will do this, they'll say like, they'll share an article in the group, in our family chat, and be like, wow, did you all see this? And I'm like, yeah, that's The Onion. That's a satire site. Like that's not a real thing. Take those opportunities to point out what is wrong about the information. And again, that's probably the only situation in which the people who need it most are actually going to encounter the educational resources. Does that make sense?
I just want to add that when you have those conversations, you want to approach things gently because people really do believe this bad information. It makes them almost feel part of a community because there is a group, people that probably have the same beliefs as them, and they're following them on Twitter, they're following them on TikTok, they're friends on Facebook, and so they hold these beliefs really tightly. And so when you do that, when you interrupt the way that they're thinking, they're going to get defensive. So just understand, that when you are approaching these topics, you want to do so gently, and then when it seems like it's getting too contentious, just disengage. Maybe they're not ready, but continue to plant those seeds. And we do have training about how to have those tough conversations as well.
Wonderful. All right, let's give one more round of applause for our panelists, Brittney, Becca, Howard, and Wendy. All right, I'd like to thank you all one last time for coming today. It really means a lot to us as a senior. This is my last event, so I appreciate everyone coming and supporting us. To Mac and to Justin, thank you for all your continued support. And a special shout out to our partners, Take It On, Greater Cincinnati Voter Collaborative, WVXU, News Literacy Project, and the Seasongood Foundation. If you want to get more involved, if you want to volunteer, you can visit cincyvotes.org or xavier.edu/takeiton. Thank you.